Welcome back to the CRC Review, your podcast providing common sense commentary on salient topics impacting our public policy, economy, and society. There is plenty of reason to hold a healthy level of cynicism in society. People cannot trust the words of our elected officials. Promises made to gain power are followed by a litany of excuses once in office. People can no longer trust reporting from our news media. Journalists no longer demonstrate any level of objectivity. Most of them advance political narratives and shield preferred subjects from any sort of deep dive into issues and situations. Consider how the national media covered the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. The response was not perfect by any means. Communication was far from where society needed it to be. Understandable that there were systemic issues governments, both federal and state, had to work through early on. But, messaging needed to be better. Our national media chose to place a great level of blame on the federal government on the Trump administration, which did deserve a fair amount of responsibility for the situation. Then there was a significant level of praise heaped on New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, both of whom led states with the highest number of deaths in the early stage of the outbreak. Now, there is information that shows information out of the state of New York was potentially purposefully misleading and manipulated for political reasons. Ironically, many in the media are not interested in a story that many Americans should be very interested in. Many media pundits cast doubts on information coming out of what they deemed red states, without any credible evidence. Now, there are legitimate sources noting that information about the COVID deaths from state-enacted policy was lowered by half to avoid federal investigations. Journalists, especially investigative journalists, continue to pat themselves on the back for bringing truth to light, even if what they report is unconvincing and incomplete. Now, there is a chance to explore truth. Real truth. Their political bias shown is a disservice to our nation and shows clearly why Americans do not trust the media. Americans should hold a healthy level of cynicism for the elected officials as well. Society does not elect our political leaders to entertain us or bask in the glory of a biased press. Rather, society charges these individuals of performing the work of the people. Political leaders need to be judged based on the results, not how well they communicate, but on how well they bring desired results to reality, as well as how well they lead the institutions of our government in an efficient and effective manner to deliver actual desired results to the people. The key phrase is desired results because our elected officials work for the people. To this point, Americans should be feeling a little buyer's remorse. The start of the Biden administration is simply continuation of the same anti-democratic practice of ruling by executive order, which he should be used to from his stint as vice president. Does it really make sense to reinstate policies that many Americans despised? That put millions of people out of work. The Obama era was neither prosperous nor secure nor a united period in our nation's history. The person promising to lead under the banner of unity is not off to a great start by any means. The person promising to defeat the pandemic is not making much inroads in that area. For months, Biden talked about having a plan, but now that he is in office, there does not seem to be much of a plan other than blame his predecessor, another staple of the Obama era. But maybe he will circle back to one. The Biden cabinet of cronies continue to use false narratives to cover the fact that they may be in over their heads. Americans expect our leaders to have solutions, not excuses. Speaking of predecessors, the Senate voted to acquit President Donald Trump for a historic second time. Did it make any sense that our Congress impeached a president no longer in office? Did it make any sense that the political party pursuing the impeachment made itself the judge of the process? The Constitution does not provide for impeachment of a president no longer in office. Probably because it hoped our political leaders would be above the fray. Democrats sought a second impeachment as a political response to some political supporters of the former president breaching the Capitol building. While the emotions of the situation is understandable, the reaction is a bit overreaching. No one wants to see our government buildings overrun during what is supposed to be a peaceful protest. The question really is whether President Trump was responsible for the actions of supporters. Is there any legitimate evidence that demonstrates that President Trump contributed to the organization of the riots and coordinated them? Would not be surprised if people who strongly support the impeachment never read or heard the actual words stated by Trump. If they did, it would be quite hard to definitely say he incited a riot. He called for peaceful protesting and letting their voices be heard. Some consider the prolonged claims of a stolen election as an incitement for violence. All can agree that President Trump should have taken the political high road rather than the path usually pursued by Democrats. The party that spent years falsely claiming election fraud in 2016, but feels justified to lecture society now. People need to accept the results of the election. A sentiment not reserved to one party. People need to weigh precedents in this matter, as the standards in how society treats highly charged rhetoric needs to be consistent. There is ample evidence showing Democrats making false claims about Trump as well as a number of their Republican opponents. Many prominent members of the Democrat Party called for the harassment and harm to political opponents and their supporters, which have led to far more violence and destruction than what took place on the Capitol. Yet, none of them believe or even offer to take any level of accountability for their roles. If our accepted standard is that politicians are not responsible for the behaviors of others, then the standard should apply here. America is a system of laws, which is built to protect against mob mentality and mob rule. For a long time, the words of Democrat leaders led to harassment of political opponents in public and at their homes, without any sort of remorse given from the speaker of those words. Led to shootings and mob assaults, yet they were not to blame. This impeachment is largely politically driven. The real end goal of the push is to impact the 2024 election cycle and possibly splinter the GOP opposition based on the supporters of Trump and the Never-Trumpers. The GOP faces the need to unite the party among shared values and coalesce the massive Trump base with traditional Republican voters, many of whom are not happy with how the party does not adequately counter the false labeling and accusations against them. Democrats can hedge their bets in 2022 and 2024 by wedging division now. Democrats understand that a candidate receiving over 75 million votes will have a good chance in the next cycle. Especially if they are unable to retain turnout from their base, if their desired policy outcomes come to fruition. Former 2020 Democratic challenger and current Senate chair of the Antitrust Committee Amy Klobuchar is taking steps to address the tech industry, focused largely on the monopolistic environment these corporate giants enjoy. There is bipartisan support for the idea of regulating the tech industry, but agreement on how to proceed appears to a point of difference. Senator Klobuchar proposes to make acquisitions more challenging by requiring tech companies to prove that the combined entity will not reduce market competition. The current approach is that the government bears the burden to prove the negative impact on the market. The complaint from some groups is that it is difficult for the government to prove because companies do not actively participate in the accusation process. There is a great importance to view this change in the midst of our strongly held legal principles. The burden of proof in a civil or criminal case is typically the accuser. Government, being the party making the accusation, would bear the burden of proof. The party being accused bears the responsibility to defend itself, but the accuser must provide adequate evidence meeting the standard of proof. Monopolistic conditions in the tech industry, and other industries, are not optimal for society or our economy. Reduced competition potentially harms consumers, despite the possible efficiencies gained by the new combined entity. The same reason why government options harm consumer outcomes. Policymakers need to weigh market competition prior to providing approval for mergers. The proposed legislation embodies the problem with our elected officials. The solution should not be adopting a radical approach that shifts responsibility because of government ineptitude. The approach seems to normalize the radical practice of guilty until proven innocent, a strong counter to our strongly held societal values. The excuse about the wealth of tech companies does not hold water. Tech companies may have billions, but the government takes in trillions of dollars, which is more. Government has the ability and resources to review deals, evaluate industries, and forecast a reasonable impact on competition and consumer outcomes. The tech industry does need some level of regulation as it impacts personal privacy and greatly influences political events. There is enough reason to implement a structure of regulation strengthening consumer privacy protection and standards in protecting fair access to the platforms. If an organization builds a business based on fostering conversation and debate, it should provide equal treatment for all parties. Government should do more to prevent the spread of corporatism. But, the burden of proof should remain with them, not the parties involved. Government already enjoys a great level of control in the process. It should not insert laziness on their part into the process. There is a great lack of sincerity in hearing our elected officials talk about wanting more jobs, more high compensation jobs, than enacted policies that directly counter those sentiments. Elected officials, especially ones that spend half a century in an echo chamber, might not understand that Americans in our current era of great access to information can see right through the carefully crafted sentiments. Consider the sentiment that people with relatively high-paying jobs working on a pipeline should switch to lower-wage positions manufacturing solar panels, many of which are not fully made domestically. The willingness to harm millions of American families all for politics is not the path forward. Society always has to move forward and change when needed. Real leaders are able to bridge that change and mitigate the externalities of the situation. Our current group of officials seem to want to make life harder. But they want to be viewed as caring and compassionate. The trajectory of our government is not heading in the right direction. Americans will continue to see and bear the costs of a split government that is unwilling to compromise. One that will focus on implementing policies that only a fringe of Americans actually support. There will be no balance in American policy. At some point, there needs to be a leader understanding society cannot continue to operate as it has been since 2009. A president claiming to be a leader that ends the uncivil war will not be successful if his vision for society is only built for one subset. Many people in government get engrossed in the great speeches of our past, but fall so far from the uniting principles those words were built upon. I am not sure Biden can be that president who changes course. President Trump chose not to be. The American agenda cannot be one built upon the needs of one group, but all Americans. Our laws, our policies, and our actions must be reflective of all voices in society. Americans should not want our society to operate as if this some episode of Game of Thrones or House of Cards. Our society needs to understand the importance of hearing all voices and negotiating towards real compromises considerate of all respective views. The great melting pot society should not be a deconstructed plate of political tribes. That is not unity. That is not America. I thank you for experiencing my podcast. For more, please continue to visit www.crcreview.com. Until next time.